All right, and welcome to another episode of More Than Therapy. Today we have Dr. Bruce Chalmer, who is a licensed psychologist and couples therapist with over 30 years of experience helping partners navigate the complexities of long term relationships. His most recent book, The Passion Paradox, is a workbook designed for couples or individuals in relationships who are in pain, not because they stop caring, but because they still do. Dr. Chalmers' previous book, Betrayal and Forgiveness, is a guide for couples navigating the turmoil of betrayal. And today, I introduce you to Dr. Bruce Chalmers. Dr. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
All right. You have a number of books that address relationship issues.
Mhm.
What was your first book and what was the mission behind it? What was the antecedent that said this book needs to be written?
Yeah. Well, the first book I wrote came out 5 years ago, just in time for the pandemic. It was really great timing. It's called Reigniting the Spark: Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. And the reason I wrote that book, it sort of grew out of a bunch of videos I had done over, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, I guess. And I realized, wow, there's a lot of stuff in here that if I pulled it together, it could be a really useful resource. And what I was putting together was mostly what I learned from working with the couples I've worked with over all those years. Um, it's based, that particular book is based around uh, a probably ridiculously oversimplified summary of what couples therapy is all about that I came up with, oh, probably 25 or more years ago. In fact, we call it Couples Therapy in 7 Words. That's the title of the podcast that my wife and I do. And the 7 words are: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And, I explain all of that. And what that book, Reigniting the Spark, is based on is basically the three principles embedded in those 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And how that can apply to recovering in a relationship from, difficulties the couple is having. And that probably applies, not probably, actually applies in life more generally, not just being in couples as well. So I wrote that book because I felt like I could pull that stuff together. And it was stuff that when I do it, when I've talked with couples about that in sessions I've had, they have told me, wow, that's helpful. You can sort of see light bulbs sometimes, and it really seems to be very helpful in helping people see things in a different way and actually make changes. So that was the first book that I wrote. And then a couple of years later, I came out with a book called It's Not About Communication, which is a rather snarky title if you think about it. In fact, the subtitle is even snarkier. The subtitle is Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. So that's my snarkily titled book. And the reason I wrote that is everybody comes to me saying, we need to communicate better. We need to communicate better. Well, of course they do. I understand what they're saying. But really, when they say that, what they think they need is tools for communication. They think they need communication techniques. Actually, the vast majority of people I'm working with are very effective at communicating. The problem isn't that they don't know how to communicate. The problem is what they are very effectively communicating. What they're often effectively communicating is anger, resentment, condescension, contempt, lots of nasty stuff. They're communicating it very effectively. They don't need tools for communication. They actually need to figure out why they're so angry at each other. And when they do, and they stop being angry at each other, they will effectively communicate that. So that was what that book was about. And that book also had, I got a little bit philosophical in there, talking about the differences between ideas and ideologies, and how when ideas harden into ideologies, it basically the ideas get bad. They turn into caricatures of whatever they started out. So that's what that book was about. And then I wrote a book on betrayal and forgiveness, as you mentioned in the intro. That was because such a substantial proportion of the folks I work with are dealing with some kind of betrayal. It's the most common one being infidelity. It's a very, very common, unfortunately, very common thing that happens in couples, and very common reason that couples end up in couples therapy. And I found the work I've done with people around that really inspiring, even though it's very difficult, it's painful for people, but it's inspiring when they can heal from that. And it really gets into a lot of that concept of be kind, don't panic, and have faith that really comes out when you're talking about healing from a betrayal. And then finally, the book that I especially would like to talk about now, it's just about to be released. I'm not sure when folks will be seeing this or hearing this, but we're recording this at the end of October 2025, and it's going to be released sometime in November. I'm not sure the exact date yet. So it should be coming out soon. Maybe by the time people are watching this, it's already available. And that book is a workbook. And I realized the stuff that I talk with couples about, so much of it is the kind of thing that I could put in a book. I'm actually planning on doing workshops based on this book as well. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily need therapy sessions for all this information. Just reading the book can be the sort of thing that can be a huge head start in doing couples therapy. So that's why I put together that book, The Passion Paradox. I just said a whole mouthful there.
Indeed. No, no, no. That's perfect. A lot of books, a lot of help, a lot of benefits. It seems like the world is hurting so much now. In my practice, I see a lot of couples, and I see a lot of couples that came, I would say, almost too late, because it's basically this is just the last thing we're doing before we've already decided to divorce. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I see that too. It's sad, the sense of it's too late. You could only wish, gee, if they could have done something before they hurt each other so much, they
right,
might have been able to turn it around. And I've seen, and you've probably seen this too. I've seen couples that do turn it around.
right,
I find that very inspiring when they can,
right.
even if they have been in a lot of pain with each other. There are often ways of doing it. I actually address that in this new book quite a bit.
The title of your book is not about communication, challenges a foundational idea in couples counseling. If
Mhm.
communication rules aren't the solution, what is the deepest, often missed root cause of a couple's distress? And what should they focus on instead of better communication?
What's happened with couples, and I'm going to speak in excessive certainty here. I don't mean to say I have all the answers here, but basically what's happened to couples is they have lost their sense of kinship. When a couple is at that place, what they've done. One of my favorite metaphors is the emotional bank account metaphor. When you have positive experiences with someone, you've made a deposit in the emotional bank account, and there's a nice balance in there. And so when there is the inevitable annoyance, because let's face it, we're all annoying. I mean, that's Lord knows I am. I'm way more annoying than my wife is. She needs that skill of being able to manage annoyance much better than I do, because I'm more annoying than she is. But we're all annoying in various ways. And when there's a nice, healthy balance in that, when people are feeling good toward each other and have good stories about each other, good understandings of each other, then there's plenty of room for the occasional annoyance, and it's no big deal. And you sort of either laugh it off or you work it out, but it's not threatening to the relationship. When that gets overdrawn, the reason I like that emotional bank account metaphor, what happens to a checking account when it gets overdrawn? Well, it's bad enough that your check bounces, and now you've really, somebody's really mad at you because your check bounced, but also you hit with a huge overdraft fee. It's worse. You're worse off than you were before. So it's very similar in the emotional bank account metaphor, that if you have little left in that account, if people have lost their sense of being kin, lost their sense that there's basic goodwill there, then what happens, and whenever there's annoyance, is it's just further information about how bad things are. And everything compounds at that point. So that's what people have lost. And so the reason I say no, the solution to that isn't communication rules. The solution to that is to try and find each other again, or decide to split up, one or the other. But finding each other isn't about communicating. It's about examining your own heart. My little slogan, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. A lot of times, the reason people lose that sense of kinship is because they get into a panic. And I'm using the word panic very broadly. I don't just mean like literally a panic attack, diagnosable. I mean where people will freak out when, they'll feel threatened by something that may just be an annoyance. And when they do that, they cannot sense their kinship. They can't be kind in that sense of sensing kinship when they're in a panic. Well, the solution to panic, and here it's a oversimple way of saying it, I'm sure, but the solution to panic is faith. And I don't mean necessarily religious faith. I'm not talking about that. It can be that, but I don't mean that. I mean more generally, if you have a mindset that says, this whole living business and this whole loving business is somehow doable, even though it's difficult sometimes, even though we don't know how all the time. That it doesn't mean everything's always going to work out all right. We don't know how it's going to work out. But a
Mm,
mindset that says, basically, this whole living business is right to be what it is. That's what I mean by faith. The couples that can manifest that are the ones who can not panic even when it's difficult. They're the couples who come in, let's say if there's been infidelity, the couples who come in By contrast, couples that come in and say, we just need rules to make sure that the person who cheated never does it again. And, the other person is saying, yeah, and I'm going to monitor your phone and all that stuff. They're not showing faith. They're trying to make it go away. The couples that come in and say, this is awful, we both feel terrible, but we can't just dismiss this. There must be something going on here we better look at. Even if it was, even if there's no question, usually when I'm seeing a couple where there's been infidelity, the one who did the cheating is clear that it was wrong. They're saying, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. It was wrong. But if you recognize, well, yeah, but they weren't crazy and they're not basically evil and not stupid, then there must be something to it. It doesn't justify it, but it helps you understand it. That's a mindset of faith. Couples that can go there can heal. And so it's the solution, if I boil it all down, is it's finding that mindset so that then you can actually tolerate the anxiety of hearing each other and figuring out what's going on without panicking. That's what will help couples heal. And none of that is about communication rules.
Indeed. You discussed the death spiral of passion, where couples prioritize stability and avoid raising anxiety, ultimately sacrificing intimacy. How can a couple learn to intentionally rock the boat in a healthy way to risk intimacy? And what does that vital risk taking look like in the day to day life of a long term relationship?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and it really is exactly what I've written about. That's the book, The Passion Paradox. The paradox in that title is precisely that you need both stability and intimacy. They're both crucial for a relationship to thrive, and yet the skills you need for one are somewhat in conflict with the skills you need for the other. That's the paradox. So, yeah, what does that look like in practice when a couple is tolerating the anxiety of intimacy? What it looks like is they're willing to say something that they're not sure how their partner will react to. Again, I'm not saying they're going to be jerks to each other. I don't mean that at all. I just mean they're willing to take the risk of saying, hey, I want to be honest with you about something. This thing has been bothering me. Or I want to be honest with you about something. I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but I would like to try something we haven't tried. And that could be in the sexual domain. That could be in, just living in a different place. It could be all kinds of possibilities. The sort of thing that you might worry, how's my partner going to react? And the couples that are willing to take that risk with generosity and compassion, and the couples, of course, where they can receive that from someone without freaking out, they're the couples that maintain intimacy over the long run. And, the problem that happens with the couples that don't do that is that lack of intimacy itself becomes destabilizing. They're both needs. A couple, my favorite metaphor about that is you think about a plant, growing from seed, and someone comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Well, it's going to try and crack the sidewalk. It won't just sit there, because living organisms want to interact. They want to be intimate with their environment. And then that applies to people, it applies to couples. The couple is a living organism. And so if it gets stifled in that way, if it's, if somebody metaphorically paves a sidewalk over it, that couple's going to try and crack the sidewalk. And what does that look like? Well, sometimes it looks like an affair. Sometimes it looks like somebody getting really depressed, or both parties getting really depressed. Sometimes it looks like somebody just precipitously saying, I'm out of here, I can't stand it anymore, kind of blindsiding the other person. And there's all kinds of things. Sometimes it manifests as a couple just argues about everything and they don't know why. All of that are symptoms of lack of intimacy. And so, getting back to your question, what does it look like when a couple can actually be okay? What it looks like is they are willing to make those risks. They're willing to say what they need to say. And what builds the confidence in a couple that they can do that is when they've had repeated experiences of that. When somebody's taking that risk and the response of the other person is, even if they disagree, the response of the other person is respectful. This plays out in lots of different domains. I mean, I don't know how explicit you would want me to get about sex in particular, but it's an area where that often plays out. The classic example of, and again, I won't get super explicit, but the classic example of one person saying to the other, hey, not so fast, or would you please do that a little differently, or something like that. Often the person receiving that isn't very graceful about it, or maybe the person saying that isn't very graceful about it. When a couple is graceful about stuff like that, when they've taken that risk of saying, this may bother you a little, but I don't exactly like what you're doing, but I'd like you to do something different. When they can receive that as a gift instead of receiving that as a criticism, then the couple's going to do well. That's an example of what it's like to risk intimacy, to actually risk being honest.
Indeed. You frame betrayal as a double whammy. I haven't
Hmm.
heard that word in so long. It used to be the show that
I'm
the
an old guy, that's
oh, it was one of my favorite shows. The whammy. But anyways, I digress. You frame it as being hurt by the act and being forced to question your own judgment, like, I thought I knew you.
yeah.
When a couple's reeling from this fundamental questioning, what is the first essential step you guide them to take to move past blame and begin the process of genuine healing and forgiveness?
Yeah, I mean, the initial really, it depends on how soon I'm seeing someone. I think, if I were going to guess how soon it is since an affair has been revealed that I will see a couple, when will they get in? It's usually within a few weeks. It's usually not that long before. So every once in a while, I've met people where they're trying to process something that happened years ago, but usually it's fairly recent. When it's fairly recent, they're still somewhat in shock. So the person who was cheated on, the person who didn't know about it, is often somewhat in shock. So the first steps, it's almost like, what do you do if you come upon an accident scene? First thing you got to do is save their life. The first thing you got to do is somehow get someone to get grounded so that they're not in constant panic, and that's just difficult initially. Those are the situations where you advise somebody, find people you feel okay with to be able to talk to, and not to complain about it or reveal things you don't want to reveal, but just find people who could be supportive, and don't make any enormous decisions too quickly as long as you're fundamentally safe. That's what you have to do initially. But once they're past that initial shock and they're trying to process it, that's when, and you mentioned the word forgiveness, that's when forgiveness starts to be really important. And I'm using the word forgiveness in a particular sense. It's really one of two ways that people use the word forgiveness, and I'm using it just in one of those ways. Sometimes people, when they say, "Oh, I forgive you," what they mean is, "Okay, we're back to where we were. We've restored the relationship. It's fine. I'm not going to think about it anymore." That's not how I'm using the word forgiveness at all. I'm using the word forgiveness, as some people will refer to it as an inside job. In other words, you can forgive somebody you have no intention of restoring a relationship with. You can forgive someone you have no intention of ever being in the presence of again, and that you don't trust at all. You can forgive someone who doesn't deserve it in any sense, that they haven't accepted any responsibility, they haven't apologized, whatever. You can forgive. It doesn't mean that you're restoring the relationship. It means you get past the initial trauma of it. You get past the shock. You can say, all right, wait a minute. I can relax in the sense of, when I think about it, I wish it hadn't happened, but I'm not in shock anymore. Now I have to figure out, what do I want to do about this? To be able, that's part of healing. That's what healing is about. To get there, you initially, and you mentioned this also, you have to forgive yourself. When you mentioned that double whammy of saying, doubting your own judgment when you've been cheated on. I just was having a conversation yesterday with a couple where this was the very thing that one of the people was saying. Just, how could I have missed this? Well, I can't believe now I can't trust anything, my own judgment of anybody. I can't trust anybody at all because, I was so hurt by this. You have to be able to forgive yourself, which is to say, you have to be able to get to that point of saying, I only knew what I knew. I didn't know what I didn't know. In that sense, I was doing the best I can. I'm not stupid. I'm not crazy. I just didn't have enough information. And maybe, even in cases where people are sort of willfully blind, which we often are, if it's, the thought that your partner could be cheating on you is just a horrible thought for most folks. And they'll want to not believe it if they can. And they'll often look back when they found out that there was cheating and say, how could I have been so stupid? It wasn't about being stupid. It was just we're all doing the best we can. That's the sense of forgiving yourself. And that, when you can get there, if I can really think, I guess I was just doing the best I could, I can extend that to the person who cheated on me. I can say, well, on some awful level, I guess they were doing the best they could too. I mean, I wish they hadn't. It was wrong. But given who they were, what they were thinking, what resentments they had going, I don't know what it was, whatever it was, I guess they were doing the best they could too. So I don't have to be angry now. Now I got to figure out what do I want to do about that relationship. And so those are the first two steps in forgiveness that I talk about in my book about betrayal and forgiveness. I actually have a third step as well that I like to talk about, which I think is every bit as important as the first two. Forgive yourself is step one, forgive whoever hurt you is step two. Forgive God is the third. Now, you don't have to be religious to appreciate that. When I say forgive God, what I mean is forgive the fact that we live in a world where you can get hurt like that. It's so painful. And yet somehow there's got to be something right about the fact that it's possible, even though it's so painful. It's kind of the standard theological question about how could a good God let bad things happen to good people. It's like, well, the usual answer to that is we have to have free will. That's kind of part of the deal. We wouldn't be people if we didn't. And if we have free will, I guess we're quite capable of betraying someone. And it's painful, but that's the world we live in, and there's good reason for it. If you can accept that, then you're in a position to say, okay, well, I'm not going to fight against the world. I'm going to work with it. Now, what do I do about this relationship? That's a whole different issue. Trust is a whole different issue.
Indeed. You talk about cultivating sacred sex, moving beyond plain old sex.
Mm-hmm.
In your view, what defines the transformation from good, intimate sex to a connection that you describe as sacred? And
Yeah.
how does this higher level of connection fundamentally change the overall relationship dynamic?
Yeah, it's when I talk about that distinction between plain old sex and then good sex, which, as you mentioned, I just mean you show up, you're intimate, you're present and honest with yourself and each other. To get to sacred sex, it's when and you can describe anything as sacred if it's no longer about whatever just itself. So somebody who's gardening could be a sacred activity if it feels like it's not just about their doing a garden and enjoying it, and all those things are great. It's also about something about being in touch with a wider reality. Sex is really a great avenue for that possibility because the forces are so powerful. It sort of takes you out of yourself. And so when a couple is not merely intimate, which is great, when they're, that sense of being really present and honest and feeling that deep sense of connection, when it's more than that, when it's about connection with the universe as a whole, that's what I mean by sacredness. People who practice tantra, they'll talk about similar things like that. I don't have a lot of knowledge about that, but it's a similar kind of concept. It's the idea that or people in a religious folks in a Western sense in a marriage where they'll feel like, yeah, God is present in that, in the act of in the pleasure, in the act, in the ecstasy, all of that. It's not just about the two of you anymore. It's about connections with God and the universe in general. So that's what I mean. And the effect that has on a relationship, it's interesting because it's not something, I think moments of sacredness, moments of peak experience of that sort of thing are not something you can just make happen. You can basically set things up so it's possible, like any sort of like a meditation practice or a prayer practice, any sort of practice that involves the possibility of experiencing that kind of sublime connection. You can make the conditions right, but you can't force it to happen. So it's not going to happen all the time. But if a couple can be intimate at that level where they can sense their connection with the wider universe, it's generally speaking, their intimacy and not just in the sexual area tends to be really intense. And that makes for a very lively, it's one way. It's funny. I was being interviewed on a podcast a few months ago and just sort of hit on this. And the interviewer was saying, yeah, well, that really was an important concept for him. It's the idea that you feel alive. That's what intimacy feels like. You feel alive. You feel like this is what I'm here to be. A couple that is feeling that way in each other's presence is a couple that stays together and wants to stay together.
Your website mentions a new assessment tool you develop as part of your research. What key dimensions of a relationship does this tool measure that most standard relationship quizzes or assessments miss? And what
Yeah.
is one surprising insight couples gain when taking it?
Yeah, well, what it is, and in fact, I have that very assessment tool. It's called the Stability and Intimacy Assessment. I actually have that as part of my new book. It's part of the exercise you do in the book. And it is indeed on the website for anybody who wants to try it out. It's as the name implies, it's measuring stability and intimacy. You're basically giving ratings. There's a bunch of questions in each of those two areas. A bunch of questions related to stability, about how you feel in your relationship, how you think your partner feels in your relationship, and then a bunch of questions about intimacy. And then there's a third section. It only has one item in it, and that item is basically asking, do you feel comfortable asking your partner to do the same thing and comparing your answers? Because that itself, I call it the what did I call it? It's a meta question, basically. That itself is an indicator of your level of intimacy. It's like, if you feel like you could actually risk comparing your answers with your partners, that itself is an indicator of intimacy. And what you learn from it, just that distinction itself, it's a distinction that in first session with couples, I almost give them a little mini lecture about the difference between stability and intimacy and the different skills you require, why they're both important, they're both needs, and yet why they're somewhat in conflict. That itself tends to be light bulb moments for the folks I work with. So that's why I developed that assessment tool. You will notice you wouldn't notice it just from doing it, but I talk about this in the book. I don't have any sort of scoring rubric for that. I don't classify you based on your answers. It's a bunch of items intended to get you thinking, and specifically thinking about those different areas of stability and intimacy. That's what tends to help people recognize, wow, these are all the ways we've been avoiding intimacy, or these are all the ways that we're feeling unstable. And that itself, again, it tends to be helpful for folks.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, I wish I knew some of this knowledge earlier in my relationships.
So me too. So do we all. You do learn. I mean, even relationships that are painful and don't work out, ideally, you do learn from them, and you apply that to future relationships.
Mm-hmm. If stability provides the roots and intimacy provides the energy for growth, how do these two forces, often seeming to pull in opposite directions, ultimately sensitize into a model of relationship success?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard because I talk about how they are somewhat inherently in conflict. What you need to do for stability, well, I talk about it in the book. What you need for stability is what I call the boring trifecta. What is the boring trifecta? And they're all good, by the way. All of these are important and good, but they're boring. You need to be responsible, you need to be reliable, and you need to be accountable, right? Those are all really important things. I'm not knocking any of them, but they're boring as hell, right? Because what that means is you got to be predictable. Predictable in a positive way, but you're not gonna shock your partner. What intimacy requires is that you be in the moment, and there's all these other forces around that are important forces that you don't totally control, and you need to be able to experience that as well. And that's not at all boring. It's actually kind of terrifying. So how do you manage to put those two things together? It's a kind of transcendence, I suppose. It's not about compromising them. It's about, well, my catchphrase about this, which I think I've already said once or twice in this conversation, it's tolerating the anxiety as opposed to avoiding it. It's recognizing, yes, this is going to be a little or a lot scary, but I'm going to go there anyway. You could say it's courage. What I say is, well, yeah, courage. People are able to show courage when they have basic faith, which is to say, there's feeling like, yeah, it's worth living this life, even when it's painful. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but it's important to live it. And that's how you manage to combine those two. And couples that are able to combine those two are very fortunate, because not everybody can. And but I think it's worth aspiring to.
Indeed, indeed. All right. What new projects do you have on the horizons, or what do you want to share with the people that they can get more involved, especially with those that have relationships that are strained and need more assistance?
Yeah. Well, the next item I'm planning on, and this will probably happen in a few months. It's going to take me a few months to get it going. I'm planning on doing workshops. I think I mentioned this earlier. Workshops that are based around the most recent book, The Passion Paradox, and it's workshops for couples. So these are not therapy sessions. These are workshops where, any number of people can sign up. You can be an individual or a couple signing up. And what you will do as part of that workshop is the stability and intimacy assessment. And you will, learn all about the ideas that I talk about that I think are helpful ideas. And we'll do some exercises that will help you, among other things, decide if you want more assistance, if you want to have a therapist or a coach or something like that. And I do offer coaching services by telehealth anyplace. And so if people want to work with me, they can, or if they want to find another therapist or a coach, they can do that as well. So that's my next big project after this book is out is going to be developing those workshops, which again will be and information on that will be on my website, and I'll plug my website now, which is brucechalmer.com. If you spell my name right, then you'll get it. brucechalmer.com. That has information about all the stuff I do. Also want to plug, I mentioned this in passing earlier too, the podcast my wife Judy Alexander and I do is called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And just like you have, we interview all kinds of guests, and I'm guessing, Felipe, that you experience this too. I certainly do. We've learned so much from the guests that we've interviewed. It's really been delightful doing it.
Indeed. And find out more about Dr. Bruce at his website, brucechalmer.com. That's spelled correctly, right?
That is spelled correctly. Thank you. Yes. Yes. And you didn't put an S on the end. I appreciate that. I won't bore your listeners with all the details about how our name ended up without an S, but just say in the old country, it wasn't Chalmer, it was Chalmer. And so,
Oh, I got you. I got
yeah.
you. All right. And that was Dr. Bruce Chalmer. And please check out his book. Tell him again.
The Passion Paradox, when you feel miles apart and still love each other.
And that's available where?
It'll be available anywhere books are sold. I mean, I would love it if people, almost hate to say it, but I love if people go to Amazon to, at least, if they don't buy it there, at least review it there eventually once it's out. That will be out again when, I'm not sure when people will be seeing this, but it's if it's any time after sometime in November of 2025, it is available.
There you go. All right. And thank you for coming, Dr. Bruce Chalmer, and presenting that More Than Therapy podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the More Than Therapy podcast, where you can listen to your favorite lessons about new books and new missions and new ways to know about recovering from things such as broken relationships, like what Dr. Bruce has brought to us on this occasion, as well as other subjects. I thank you for your presence, and I thank you for being who you are and doing the work that you do. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the More Than Therapy podcast, wherever you listen or watch your favorite podcast. Until then, be well and be great.